Do you want to master ExpressJS faster than most developers? Coding a Hello World page or a basic REST API isn't enough though. I've worked with Express for years and I'll show you the 3 key concepts behind Express and how to use them to build nearly everything. By the end, you'll feel like Express is super easy. And creating a web app with Express takes only a few seconds. Create a new directory. Initialize a node project with npm init. Install Express with npm. Create a JavaScript file and create an instance of Express. And absolutely nothing happens. But before we fix this, let's make sure we are on the same page about what we are building here. So the client, whether it's a browser, a mobile app, or a device, sends a HTTP request to the server with a method and a path. The server uses that to figure out what the client wants and sends back a response. What we are building here with Express is the application on the server that handles the request and return the responses. In this crash course, we're not going to build just 1, but 3 apps. And all it takes is mastering the 3 core concepts of ExpressJS. And once you've mastered these concepts, everything becomes easy. So let's start by fixing our code with the first concept, the application. I absolutely love noise-canceling headphones, but they annoy everyone around me because I can't hear them. To interact, you have to listen. And it's the exact same for our Express app. It can only interact by listening to incoming requests on a given port. You do this by calling app.listen with a port number, and you can also have a callback and log a message when the application is up. Now let's start our app, and something is happening. The application is up and it's responding to requests, but every request gets the same result, a 404 not found response. Basically, our web server is telling the client, I don't have the resource you're asking for, and that's where routing comes in. Without it, our app has no idea what to do with the different requests. Even without headphones, I can be very annoying because I only respond to certain cues. If someone asks me, do you want a coffee? The answer is yes in the morning and no thanks in the afternoon. Every other interaction gets a not found response. An Express app works the exact same way. You define how to respond to specific requests through routing. Let me show you. To respond to a GET request on the route path, you will use the app.get method, and the first parameter is the path, and the second parameter is the handler function. For now, just know that the handler function has access to a response object, which you can use to send something back to the client. Here, we'll just return a hello world message. You can do the same on other HTTP methods like post, put, delete, and you can handle requests on other paths. Here, I've used the path coffee. Routes can be defined as strings, path parameters, or regular expressions. You can even use named parameter. For example, here I have coffee brand name to get a coffee by its brand name, but we'll look at this a bit more in detail when we build a REST API later in the video. Any request that doesn't match a defined route will get a 404 response, but for any other request that matches a defined route, we will get an answer coming from a request handler. But here is what sets ExpressJS apart. The request handler isn't just a handler, it's a middleware, and that's what makes Express so powerful. When someone asks me if I want a coffee, I first think about how many coffee have I already had, what time of the day is it, how busy I am, and then I give a response. And that's exactly how Express handles requests. A request passes through a chain of functions, and at the end of that chain, a response is sent to the client. And each function in that chain is a middleware. So middleware are functions that have access to the request object, the response object, and a next function. And when a middleware function is called, you can implement whatever logic you want, and you can modify the request and the response object, whatever you need. And once you've done that, you have two options. End the request response cycle, for example, by calling the response send method, or call the next function, which passes the control to the next middleware in the chain. This is a simple but incredibly powerful pattern, and you'll see that pattern in action throughout the rest of the video. But for now, let me show you an example by creating a URL logger middleware function. The URL logger middleware function takes three parameters: the request object, the response object, and the next function. And inside that middleware, you can log the request URL to the console, and don't forget to call the next function, because if you don't call the next function, the request will just hang and the client will be waiting forever. Now let me show you how to use that middleware. You can chain middleware function by passing multiple parameters to the root, or you can use an array of middleware function, but just remember that the order matters. If one of the middleware calls response.send, this ends the request cycle and anything after won't run. But if you wanted to use the same middleware for all your root, it would be quite tedious to add them manually to each root. Instead, you can load your middleware at the application level using the app.use method and pass your middleware as a parameter. You can also restrict the middleware to certain root by passing a path as the first parameter of app.use. For example, you could restrict the middleware to the coffee path. And remember, the order matters here too. If you load the middleware after defining all your root, it will be placed at the end of the middleware chain. Now that you have a solid understanding of the three key concepts of Express, in theory, you should be able to build anything. But practice is better than theory, so in the next part, I'll show you how to serve static files, how to build JSON REST API, and how to create a dynamic site using Template Engine. And by the end of this, you'll have mastered the fundamentals of Express. So let's write some more code. Sorry, but I lied. We're not building three separate Express apps, but instead we'll build three mini apps inside our main app using Express Router. We are going to build the world's best dish, a static site that shows the world's most famous dishes, Gourmet API, a REST API for managing recipe data, and Chef's Dashboard, a dynamic site for viewing and editing recipes. And each of these mini apps will have its own router. So let me show you how to set up a router. First, you create an instance of the router, then you define the route for that router, and finally, you mount that router to a specific path. And all the route of that router will be accessible under the greeting path. But this code should feel familiar to you. Indeed, a router is just a middleware, and just like any other middleware, you load it using the application use method, and you can restrict it to a given path, which is exactly what we did here. I told you, once you know the core concepts, everything starts to make sense. So now you can create a router for each mini application and mount each router to a specific path. By giving each mini app its own router, we can expand or update each part independently. So let's start with our first mini app, the world's best dish. Our first app will use the built-in Express static middleware to serve static files like HTML, images, and CSS. So here is how it works. I have already created a public folder, and in there I have an index file and a CSS file. And then you go into your main JavaScript file, and in there I'm using the Express static built-in function with the path of the folder where I have my static files, and I use that to create a static middleware, and I load the static middleware in the website router. And now the website router is set up to serve all the static files inside the public folder. Public is just a convention, but any name pretty much works. Using a factory function like ExpressStatic that creates and returns a middleware function is a very powerful pattern. So let's use this pattern to make a create website router function that sets up a website router with a configurable parent directory. So the function gets the parent directory path through the option argument, and then we can use that to set up the router, and we return the router. And then we just call the function to get a router, and finally we call create website router to create our router. This approach gives you much more flexibility. You can move the function into its own file and in its own folder, alongside the public folder as well. And now everything related to the static website is organized into its own folder. And after adjusting the file directory, everything is ready and you can visit your static website under the dishes path. With the world's best dish setup, you now know how to serve static files with Express. But let's take things one step further and build something more powerful, a REST API. The Gourmet API is a REST API for managing recipe data and will provide CRUD operations, and I'll show you in more details how Express handles requests and responses. To start, let's create a root file inside a new Gourmet API folder, and in there I'll use some mocks in-memory data instead of using a real connection to a database. And then after that, you create a router instance and you can set up some basic routes for your CRUD operations. And then you export your router, and inside your main JavaScript file, you can import your new router, and as usual, you load it under the same path. Now that we have our basic setup, let's focus on route handlers. Like any other middleware, they take the request and response objects as parameter, and the request object contains everything about the incoming request, like body, parameters, and queries, and the response object allows you to send a response back and set up details like status code, headers, and cookies. When you know how to use the request and the response object, you are in total control of the request-response cycle. So let's put that into practice by implementing the handlers. Let's start with the getRecipes route. Here you can replace the send method by the JSON method to return the recipes as a JSON array. RequestSend and RequestJSON are just two of many response methods. You can also use requestStatus to set status code, or requestRedirect to redirect the client, or render views, which we will explore in more details when we implement the Chef's Dashboards application. So now let's implement the post-create-route handler. You can add the new recipes to the recipes array by using the data from the request body, and then set the status to 201 created instead of the default 200 OK response, and finally return the new recipe as JSON. But there is an issue with this code. By default, the request body is a string, so you could decide to manually parse it, but you can also automatically parse it as JSON by using the built-in ExpressJS middleware. This transforms the request body to an object, and in your own middleware, you can similarly transform or add properties to the request object. For example, you could have a custom middleware that adds a user property for access control. Now in the getRecipesById route handler, you can use the request parameters to get the ID parameter. And then if you found the recipe, you can return the recipe as JSON or return a 404 not found response. And here you'll notice that I've converted my request parameter ID into a number to match my recipe model. So far, we've completely relied on Express default error handling, but later I'll show you how to add your own custom error handlers. For updating or deleting recipes, the approach is very similar. You extract the ID from the request parameter, then you delete or update your recipe, and you return a 404 not found response if the recipe does not exist. With the core endpoints implemented, you can send requests to retrieve recipes, create recipes, update recipes, and delete recipes. So this completes our Gourmet API setup. Next, we'll use this API in the Chef's Dashboard app to create a dynamic site for managing recipes. Dynamic content is a must for many web pages, like showing the username, a list of items, or conditional messages. And to achieve this with Express, you can use a template engine. A template engine lets you create files that mix static content, like HTML, with dynamic content that's generated using variables. For example, we'll use the EJS template engine, a very popular choice for rendering dynamic content in Express. Other options include Pug and Handlebars. First, you need to install the EJS template engine. Then you need to tell your app Express to use EJS as the view engine. You can also set other application settings with the application set method, such as query parsing or environment configuration. We'll create a new router file inside the dashboard folder, and in that file we will have a create web app router function, and that function will return a router. It will also take some options. It will take a parent directory path as option, a base path, and a recipes API URL. We will be using that later. Our route handler will include a route to render the home page, a route to render the form to add a new recipe, and a post add route to handle form submissions, and a 404 route to render not found pages. And of course, let's not forget to export the function we've just created and import it inside our main JavaScript file here, and we will be creating the web app router using our factory function and pass the correct parameter. We will be using this API URL to call our Gourmet API we implemented before. Let's start by creating a simple 404 template page inside a views folder, and this page will be a simple generic error page with an error message and a link to go back to the home page. And in that link, we will be using the base path variable to generate the link dynamically. To render this view, you can use the response.render method, and the first argument is the path to the view file, and the second argument is an object with the variables you want to send to the view. You can manually navigate to the 404 page to see the error page, but the goal is to automatically redirect users to that page when they try to access any route that is not defined. And to achieve this, you add a catch-all route and you use the response redirect method to send the users to the 404 page. Remember, route order is important, so make sure the catch-all route is defined after all other routes so that it doesn't interfere with any of the other valid paths. Let's render the home page with a list of recipes. This is the first time we will be using asynchronous code inside our route handler. So we will fetch the recipes from the Gourmet API we implemented before, and we will pass the recipes as a variable to the index view. And in the index view, we can loop through the recipes array and display each recipe's name. But you need to be very careful with asynchronous code, because as is, the error thrown here will not be caught and your app will crash. Instead of throwing the error, you need to use the next function and pass the error to the next middleware in the chain. This allows Express to handle the error properly. But this also assumes that you are using Express 4 like me, but if you are using Express 5, thrown errors inside asynchronous code will be handled automatically by the default handler. Instead of relying on Express default error handler, you can create your own custom error handling middleware, and an error handler middleware takes 4 parameters: the error and the request object, the response object, and the next function. Here you can create a generic error handler that just logs the error and return a 500 status and renders a generic error template. The custom error handler should be defined after all the routes and middlewares, so this ensures that it catches any error that can occur. Now, if you want to allow your user to create new recipes, you can create a new template view with a form that submits post requests to the add route. In the form, the action attribute will have the form submission path, and the method attribute will have the HTTP method to send data to the server. And next, you can update your getAdd route handler to render the newly created template file. To process form submission, you need to use the built-in ExpressURL encoded middleware. This will allow you to get the form data accessible through the request body object. Next, you can implement your post route handler, and in here we are going to get the data from the request body and send a request to our Gourmet API to create the new recipe and redirect the user to the home page. And that's just the beginning. What makes ExpressJS even more powerful is its ecosystem. With built-in middleware for common tasks and high-quality third-party options like Passport for authentication, you can do much more. You don't have to start from scratch. You can leverage the ecosystem to build apps faster and more efficiently. You can check out this Nest.js crash course, which builds on Express to provide a more structured and opinionated approach to building Node.js applications.